Hi there, Randy Green here. Let us continue. I want to take a little bit of a different avenue than I began in the first two videos. In this one, I want to continue my talk about the Skandhas, or the 5 layers that a human is composed of. And although that I work with the concept of anatta, or no self, and always compared it to, is it the inner higher self or the outer psychology structure? As always with the discussions about different forms of theories, and when we study ancient texts, there are different interpretations of it. But if we work with the idea that the non-self is talked about it that way because what we could perceive as, I have a body and then I have a soul, and that's the classical Greek interpretation as well. The soul is technically what we have it in Greek. It's called you have the body and then you have the psyche, which is interesting. But in their perception, psyche is technically what we see as soul, and then on top of that one they had nous, which is knowledge. So you see, it was kind of in the mix at the time, even though we could say that the Greeks were later than the Buddha, but more or less not that late, because we're talking about 560 BCE with the Buddha, and some of these ideas of body and psyche and the inner human are around 300 BCE or something like that. That's where we have the oldest levels of Greek text, but there could definitely be earlier text in Greek which we just don't have access to. So it's not that far from each other, and it's probably some kind of conceptualization that were happening at the time. We also have things that were going on with some of the mystic levels of I'm not going to go there. Okay, back to where I want to go with this one. So if we, in that clarity, that moment of clarity I had when I was talking about anatta, and I was talking about the non-self, and this mix-up that my mind had done with that, it was more related to what we'd call there's no soul, which is the typical interpretation. But if we work with it as a self and see it as an ego structure, and there technically is no ego structure, then I am in complete alignment with the Buddhist teaching system. And again, and my idea for doing this is both to activate new levels of my brain capacity, which I think I said anterior. I think that's actually the front, whereas it's posterior when it's the back. Again, the brain has this tendency to mix things up, which is a little bit unfortunate, but the brain does that. And you will, those of you who work with information, you will see that from time to time. Just think about a memory you have, how easily it gets muddled up with different other memories, and it's difficult to keep it in its correct context. Anyways, so moment of clarity. Randy Green had a moment of clarity, and I love that because I like knowledge. So the moment of clarity was that, okay, non-self is perhaps not as much about the eternal being that keeps reincarnating. It might as well just be focused on in the context of impermanence, suffering, and non-self, understanding that as long as we identify ourselves with what we understand as the personality structure and see that that is our soul, so to speak, if we go with the classical Greek interpretation as a psyche, then that's where we get in trouble. So I think that is probably a more valid interpretation of it, that more suits the time and the era we are here talking about. And at the same time, it matches completely what I'm teaching and what I'm sharing in my classes. And I want to go in here a little bit and actually give you some exemplification of why that is, that they are impermanent, and why we can't really say that this is who we are, because we know that we change over time. We know we age. We know when we wake up in the morning, we're one person. When we go to bed later on, we're another person in many ways, because we have had many different experiences, and how we felt when we wake up is not how we feel when we go to bed. And when we dream and be part of our dreams escape, we are again something else when we wake up, and onward and so forth. So this whole concept of being I'm always who I am. I always the same personality. I'm always, this is me kind of thing is, that is in many ways, at least in Buddhist thinking as well as in my thinking, not what we could call flirtatious approach to ourselves as a living entity that is in flux, constant flux, that are living in a reality of energy, which we know from science as well, of which most is emptiness, by the way, but at the same time are in this complex structure of a physical form. And even though the physical form changes slowly as far as we are concerned, which it actually doesn't, but what we can perceive with the normal human mind, then to impose that on our inner human and say, well, the inner human, the psyche or the soul is actually completely also something that is the same, that is also constantly being what that is. And again, I'm just kind of here thinking about when we go into Hindu rebirth, where we have these children that recall who they were in their past lives and how that perhaps talk to the idea of, oh, this is the same self, we change body, but who and whatever we are on the inside is the same. And this is where the teachings come in and say, no, that's actually inaccurate. And it would be a limitation and boundaries we put upon ourselves that are inaccurate because it prevents us from progressing. And if we do follow with the line of the Hindu caste system and says, okay, if we have this idea of a permanent inner human that keeps reincarnating in different bodies until they wear out and you become an insect, well, does that insect then have that personality structure? Just asking the question. But if that's the case, well, then that ideology is perhaps, if I may say so, more political than it is actual spiritual. Because if it would be a way to control control the humans and maintain the Hindu caste system, if you say it's always the same inner self that reincarnates. So therefore, if you were born a peasant in the past life, you will also be born a peasant in this life. And that's why you got that mark on your forehead that shows you which caste you belong to. And you will forever be born into that hierarchy because it's this determined by the gods. And if we think it in that philosophy, then we can say, well, then the Buddha is not only trying to give us, this is the completion cycle, this is what you need to do when you do the return path. It is actually also political in that manner, as we see it we have the discussions about the Joshua mission and what is left in the Gospels, which can also be interpreted in a political context, which is a whole other discussion I'll take at another time. I just think that should be put in here because when we talk at that time in human history, there were very strong hierarchical structures, including who could be allowed to say what, when, and what were the implications of it. And when we talk about some of the, when we go to the inner realities and become part of our expanded version of the non-self into the higher levels of all of the selves that we have had, where we also understand that that is changeable as well. And we can't identify ourselves with any of these versions of ourselves, but we can derive the knowledge from them and integrate that and make it part of who and what we are in this life, in this physical form. Then we also understand that these different, whether they are the formless beings, the arupas, or whether they are divine, or they are from the lower realms of our existence, our reality, or they're from complete outside of our reality field. There are these weird hierarchical structures and what we're allowed to and what we're not allowed to, because you're here in this form and you're here in this reality, and therefore you are not allowed to do this or you're not allowed to do that. So that technically also plays in, and that has been some of the rules of engagement that are a complex system of the different races that are here and how they perceive our position within their hierarchical structure and what they see us to be, similarly as we have with the Hindu caste system. There's probably a reason why the gods imposed that on humans in India. So when we go with the five they call it the aggregates, and I understand the word that this is kind of things that are put together. Aggregation, it's drawn together. And if we are kind of clinging on to these different levels of our existence, there are 5 skandhas, as they're also called, and I see them as 5 rings. And I want to explain a little bit in what how I can expand that into my own teaching system, and that is you have the 3 lower fields, which is the biofield, the emotional field, the mental field. Then I divide it into a 6-layered energy system that technically goes with mental activity or formations, which I will explain on its own within its own context, and then consciousness, which I also work with. That's what I see as the upper template. I just see these as constructions in a different way, but I want to braid it into these 5 skandhas because I don't feel that they are going against each other. On the contrary, I think that perhaps, or I would like to think that what I'm working with is kind of an expansion of I'm not saying, oh yeah, I'm continuing the teachings of the Buddha, not at all, because this is something, there's a lot of people that have been working with trying to figure this one out, and we have got many different interpretations of what the energy system actually is. But I'd like to put it in context of Buddhism, because it's always good to have something to hold your ideas up against and see, is there some kind of, could they braid? Could they kind of create some kind of, could they be included in each other, bridge to each other, so that we kind of get a deeper understanding of both teaching systems and say, well, that's perhaps, as discussed other places, that we are always, when we are in this reality, we're building upon all of the knowledge that others have made as well. So if I am kind of making this weird crossing, as we also saw in Blavatsky and in Bailey and the Theosophical community that were tying both into Buddhism and Hinduism, which I also am, because it's a little bit kind of that what do you call it? I forgot the name there. Tradition. I'm a little bit into that tradition in working with what we'd say, well, there is a foundational knowledge to everything. So what is that foundational knowledge? And then figuring out, okay, how does that apply to me in this time, in this era, and with who and what I am today? And I also came to think a little bit about whether it is a true memory or an inserted memory, my past life as a Buddhist, and how my demise was there in torture and horrible death. And having lived like a Buddhist monk my entire life, more like a little bit like a warrior monk, probably, since I ended up that. So that was definitely political, right? There is a lot of politics regarding Buddhism when we think about the implication of China, Tibet, and these things that are going on. There's a lot of politics involved in religion as well, even though there's a lot of people that want to kind of divide state and religion, but it isn't. And in the old days, these two things were very, very closely interconnected. So if we kind of go with that idea that that was my demise and I wake up in this body 9 years later, then it's just kind of, what happened? Why am I reborn? I lived as a devout monk. I did all the right things. I did all the right teachings. And then the question would be in this life for me to figure out what went wrong. That would be a good approach to kind of say, okay, why am I driven to find the answers? Why am I driven to find these sciences? Why am I driven to ask these questions if I kind of thought that, yeah, I can do, even though I do in torture, die in torture, and I have all this kindness and compassion to my torturer, and I'm looking at them from this elevated view of things and saying, yeah, I can see you're stuck in your cycles, and the soldiers, you are who you are, and you are just doing the bidding of your lords, and you don't know what you're doing, as it said in the gospel. So I can completely forgive you because you are not aware of whatever's happening, and similarly as the torture and death of Jesus on the cross, right? So this is just this kind of, yeah, I'm above all of this floating around, and yes, this is just my body, and yes, you're torturing it, and yes, it's very, very painful, but this life is pain and suffering. So I can lift above it. I can transcend it. I can go into my meditative state. I am complete control of my frontal lobes. I shut down my amygdala. I shut down my limbic system, and I put my instinctual level on standby. So I don't flee. I don't do anything. I'm just stepping outside of my body and letting you torture it to death because I am ready. I'm going to Nirvana. I'm taking, not that it's that way, but you could put that in as well. I'm doing the martyr death here, right? I'm doing the difficult death where I'm not just sitting in the monastery meditating myself into sleep and then cross over. No, I'm doing it in a manner that is suitable for the time and what was going on in Tibet. In the 1959 times around that with China and the things that were going on there. So that would be a valid interpretation, and then wake up. I know I have other aspects of my process inside this body and what's been going on. And I've been talking about that other places, about, what we call a situation I had around 3 or 4 years old where I technically think that I walked in. But the question is then the experience of death in the past life, was that the experience of my body, or was that the experience of the walk-in that also is part of me? So that's a good question to take that into consideration. Say, okay, how do I deal with that? How do I deal with that weird psychological dissonance that comes in play there? Not that I identify myself with the Buddhist monk or saying, that's me, or identify myself with the level of me that's the walk-in and say, no, that's me, or this body, that's me, and the memories that are in this body and the past lives that are connected to this body, which I also have recalls of, that has also affected me in my inner work and my awakening process. So there's absolutely nothing simple when we really begin to do the clearing work and do the purification work of who and what we are, and get into contact with all of the levels of our existence. So the 5 skandhas are one form that is called rupa. That is the material image or impression. That is kind of what we are seeing. And I actually think it's a good idea when it's called a material image. That's interesting because you know me with background in the Old Testament. When the supreme powers, the Elohim, they are in the book in Genesis, the first book in Genesis, the first creational story. There are 2. There's Adam and Eve, but there's the one prior there. Adam and Eve is Yahweh, that is creating Adam and Eve out of dust and blow ruach or spirit into their nostrils and get Adam first to life, and then he takes from the side of Adam and then creates Eve. But in the first Genesis, the first creational story in Genesis, it is the supreme powers, and they are on day 5 or 6, I can't remember. They are creating the male and female in their impression, and that impression is an image. It's called imago Dei, in the gods, in the image of the gods. Right. So that is interesting. That is called the material image, because is it, as we're having when we talk about many of the divine beings that are human-like, are we created in their image? Because if we are created in their image, then of course we also have the divine powers. That's a whole other discussion. That's one of the theosophical discussions that goes with what was Jesus actually trying to teach us. Was he trying to teach us, as it goes with the rabbis and their the more secret levels of their teachings, that us returning to the state of innocence that were before the fall, that was the pushing out the Garden of Eden, were to where we were in the image of God. So we were pushed out. We had the image of God, which means we had all the divine capacities. But because we didn't follow the laws of the Garden of Eden, then we were pushed out, or the forefathers of us were pushed out. And then we have lived inside this reality, dressed in skin clothing, which is a little bit a double. Is it the skin we are having, or is it actually skin like animal skin that are put on like clothes? that's another rabbinic discussion, that were we light beings in the Garden of Eden, and then we fell, and then we were pushed outside, and the two angels with the flame sword stood in the way, and we were dressed in skin clothing, as in, was it there we got the physical form from being light beings and going into be physical form, and will return to the heavenly Jerusalem actually mean that we go back into our light form? St. Paul will a little bit onto that idea when he called the body a tent, and we were to shed off this tent and resume our original divine image, which were in the image of the Elohim. So that is also interesting in itself. So when we go with that material image or impression, and we're saying that is what people perceive that we are, that is the perception of us, to put it that way. So that's the form we have. And whether or not it's materialistic or not, that is a good question, because what is materialism in terms of, we now know with, when we talk about the atoms and molecules, and we know the further we go down, the more we become nothingness and emptiness, and the huge space in between the little fragments of energy that is actually composing the atom. So that is also interesting. So, and that goes also into the whole perception of form as are we, the only reason why we exist in this physical form is because we have the understanding that we exist in physical form. That's a whole other discussion that also can be taken at some point. Or are we kept in form because we have the biofield behind? And that's my claim. We have a code field that keeps us in this form. But that code field is the end result of different energy patterns, which I will explain in a little minute. So we have the sensations or feelings received from the form, which I technically both agree with, but it also goes the other way around. We have what we feel also affects the physical form. So it's not just the electrochemical processes that defines our feelings, which are what we would call coming from our form, which is accurate, that science agrees with that sensations are electrochemical processes that are creating specific understandings in our brain, all depending on what we have learned that these emotions are. So that means that if you what you perceive as your emotions in many ways are culturally determined. It's determined by the what level of reality you're living in, so to speak. What I mean is your culture, your country, how much you talk about these sensations. Are they interpreted as feelings, or are they literally just physical sensations that comes from the form itself as it goes through its different fluctuation as a sort of living being that has electrochemical processes, neurological processes? You have convulsions, you go to the loo, and all of these kind of things. This is just these sensations they are talking about. So are we putting on feelings that the Buddha was not talking about, who is just talking purely about the bodily sensations, because then it's something else, right? And then there are the perceptions, which I call the minefield, that are kind of the interpreting faculty of everything that's going on. That these are the perceptions where you have the form and you have the sensations of the form, which we can say are electrochemical, and leave out the whole emotional spectrum, right? And just say these are just perception of these two faculties that we are having, that yes, we have a form and all the things that are going on there, and that form gives up sensations which we interpret and perceive in a specific way. But then they come in and call it the mental activity or formations. And I think I would be confused there, because I would love to say the perceptions are the same as mental activity. But if I go into the detail where I say, no, these are the 6 layers of how we process information, and I'll explain that later on, then that makes sense, because then we are in that expanded mental level of our existence, which the Hindus call manas. That is, you have mind and you have manas. These are 2 different faculties of your human being. And we can say, I call this density energy. So technically, it's more as a more subtle perception of what we could call your brain. So the perceptions are part of the brain, but the mental activity or formations are outside of the brain, technically, if you want to put it in details. So it is energy patterns, mind patterns that are created outside the brain neurological structure. These are on a more subtle level. And then we have the most extended subtle level, and that is the consciousness, which I place in the upper template. And I explain these different levels, and you can say in the basic concepts, I'm going into a little bit, this is the outer reality and beginning to working a little bit with that. And then in the whole transition science classes, I go into the inner levels, and I go into the definition of these different fields that we are created of, and go into the mental activity of formation in this 6-layered energy system. I call this in between. That's the transformative energy system that is put there to transform energy. That's all that it does. And then the consciousness in the upper template, which is part of the template science, is where I explain what that is. So in that manner, I'm not far from what we could call the Buddhist interpretation of things, which I find interesting and yes, I was going to put something else there. It gives a sort of validification or validity to what I've been working with. But no, as I also know, it's not, you cannot say, oh yes, because I can see it's there, does not mean that it's actually there, because I know as well that if you are from another branch of understanding, you will see exactly the same thing, because you will interpret it within your context of reality and your context of frames of references and what you would have been working with throughout your life. So to go a little bit in, why is it that our physiological form that holds a biofield behind it are impermanent? And for me, it's because it has many layers. So if we just say it's just my body and just see it as a physical thing, then the attempt to try and master the energies of the body becomes a little bit complicated, because it's kind of, okay, you have the cellular structure. What does that actually mean? What is the cellular structure made of? And I know the Buddha didn't ask that, because he was not into cells and atoms and these kind of things, at least not as what we know. But if we go in and if I go in and look energetically at my body and begin to deconstruct it into its single units, and not just going with what science tells me, but goes beyond and use my fourth aggregate or my fourth Skandhas, where I have the mental field and begin to process the information and dribble it into a higher order type of perception using my brain in a different way, to put it that way, then I will come up with a different classification. And for me, when we talk about the biofield and what composes the physical form, then we have in the time of birth, or when you are not birth, but when you come to be, when the field that is behind your body, when that comes to be, and that's the lower merged energy fields of the parents that gives that, let me put it in the correct context because I'm not reading it correctly. The merged lower energy fields of the parents lay the lower field blueprint of us. So what is that? That is a time of when mom and dad are having sex. Yes, I know your parents never had sex, but they did, otherwise you wouldn't be here, right? Mom and dad had sex, and while they're having sex, their fields merge. It does that every time people have sex, not just when a little child is created or the sperm and the egg are meeting up, but all the time when man and a woman, or two women or two men or whatever, are having sex. The sexual energies merge, they blend, the energy fields blend on all levels of what you are. That's why we should be a little bit careful with just sharing our sexual energies with whomever and whatever and in whatever situation, because this is an enormously strong merge where a lot of transfer happens. But in times of when there is a little child to be born or come to be, I will not go further into details with this, because there's much more to it than that. There's a reason why that's even possible. But let us just keep it simple here. Then mom and dad are merging fields. With or without orgasm, it doesn't matter. Egg and cell or sperm is being spilled, as it's so nicely said. It is ejected, and it travels its way up, and it reaches not always at the same time, But that's because when females, especially, we say, well, it's because of the oxytocin that we are feeling the impression of the sexual encounter more for up to 3 days after. But technically, it's actually because we have our fields are still vibrating from the male's field. So the male's field is still within the female up to 3 days after. Males have a tendency to shed it off a little bit quicker because it's not necessary to linger on in males, so they can technically, that's why they can be a little bit more free bees and fly around and dip into different flowers without having the same energetic effect of it as females have. But females carry the imprint of the male up to 3 days. And we're saying, oh, that's just oxytocin, and that's why I've connected, and now I feel so in love with him, and whatever that's going on in females after some pretty good sex, right? But the matter of the fact is that she carries his male field inside of her, and that's what she interprets as having fallen in love or being connected or whatever. And that's also why females are not as much anymore, but it used to be that females were less inclined to have many sexual encounters because they figured out this has a huge impact on me. It affects me. And sometimes I actually think that I'm in love, which I'm not. But the reason why the female has that is because she carries the possibility of creating life in her womb, and she needs the male field to be there to lay the blueprint of the child. So that's why. So just to put that one in context. And once that merged field from the parents have been put together, and you can say, why does some encounters end up in pregnancy and why does some encounters not? And at a specific point in time, mom and dad might have had unprotected sex many times, but mom never got pregnant. And suddenly mom gets pregnant. Why is that? That's because that's when there is this, again, this is when, let's see it, not assault, but an entity is ready to get into physical form, this is what has been distorted into astrology and your birth chart, but there are specific sequences and nodal points in the reality field with crossing of timelines and different openings and closings of gates and different positions of the planets in relation to who and what you are and your past lives and the cycles you're in and what type of energy that comes into play at that time of day and on that day in that month that allows for the entry of a soul into this reality. Very complex. So that's why the mom gets pregnant at that time. And the possibility that comes with that opening is that karmic blueprint or past life layers, they can be inserted into the core of the cellular blueprint. And that's what we call the etheric field, so to speak. So you have the blueprint, but when the karmic or past life layers that are part of the permanent atom enters into that joint field, that's when time is ready for it. That's where there is that opening in our reality field. The gates open so someone can enter. And interesting enough, this is when we talk about the constellation of the crab. I don't like calling it Cancer because it's not, but the crab. In old Babylon, that was the human gate into the world. If that was what the crab was on the constellation, which is interesting. And from that blueprint, the karmic blueprint, the joint fields of the parents and the opening and closing of the gates that activates a specific level of that joint blueprint, which is now created into a third level. So you have mom and dad's energies, but you now have something that's added onto it that creates again a synergetic effect, the triangle, the trinity structure. From that, the cellular blueprint itself is laid, and from that is what the cells begin to unravel what they hold of content. So the code layer that stems from past lives affecting the genetic fragments in the center of the cell, that is what creates the DNA. The code layers. I've here explained technically how DNA is created in you and how the chromosomes come to be that defines whether you're a male or a female and what that will unfold. But I also know that some of the ones that are anticipated to be males and they turn out to be females, I've seen that in some of when I was laying the template readings, and some of the races that were behind that, they got a little bit surprised. They were actually anticipating that this was supposed to be a boy, and then it turned out to be a girl. And then they couldn't use that human body for anything, because that soul that was supposed to come in was supposed to come into a male body, and then they just leave the physical form on its own as a kind of a half shelf. So that is also going on inside our reality. So from that, then we have the emotional layer that is transmitting the coding from the reality field distortion layers, generating the perimeter of the cell. So we already have that. So it grows from inside and out. And from the karmic layers, we both have the genetic fragments that are drawn in, and we have how the cellular structure is to look, and the DNA, and then the perimeter of the cell that goes with all of the, what we could call the epigenetics, the outer layers, the electrochemical processes. They are part of the emotional layer, or the emotional field. That is what we interpret as the psyche, but that's technically just the electrochemical processes that are laid from that. But the way the electrochemical processes are interactively becoming agents in our body and creates that specific type of sensation which we interpret in a specific way due to our karma and due to our emotional field and due to the patterns we have from past lives. And again, that's karma, but the patterns and the karma are technically two different things, because you have the patterns of your past lives, but the karma is the unfinished business, so to speak. That is what you have of talents with you that goes with the Dharma, that goes with the laws, the cosmic laws, that defines how these patterns are supposed to unfold in this life, which is also an interpretation of what Dharma is. That it's both cosmic law and order, but it's also the manuscript of your life, what you're supposed to unfold in this life with what you have been given of talents. Right? So that's also what Dharma is, if we look at it in what we call the great aspect and the more local aspect that is within ourselves. So we have this whole being that we are created that are determined by the cosmic laws of when it's time to be reborn, so to speak, and everything that comes in play when we are reborn. But at the same time, it's also defining our path in life and what we're supposed to do with these patterns, what we're supposed to achieve according to the cosmic laws. And that's the double level of Dharma. You both have the individual, what you need to clear out and work with to avoid further regression. But at the same time, you're also up against what we call the cosmic laws of what you were supposed to achieve with the talents you were given originally. So this is kind of a double Dharma, right? Double Dharma. That's a new word of saying things. Then we have the subconscious layer with the suppressed energetic interaction potentials of the energetic patterns. So the subconscious layer it's all of our past lives, so to speak, that are there, but they are not actively part of us yet. That's part of the awakening process. So what is generated into the energetic pattern is controlled by the content of the distortion fields. That is everything we have gathered in all the lives we have had. And again, remaining technologies, which again goes into what we could call the alien agenda. But all of this determines the perception field of the ego triangle. So here I'm not at all working against what is in the Buddhist teachings. On the contrary, I'm just expanding on it to put it that way. And then I will not go into this here, but when we then go into, and this is part of the advanced work with the emotional field and the rings that it composes and the different energy currents that comes from technically 9 layers here. I have just put up our 8 layers that are similar in the cell. The perimeter of the cell holds the same layers as the emotional field, and the core of the cell holds the same levels of energies of the mental field that are divided into different rings, from where the whole composition of what we are changes all according to where you're working. On what level are you now perceiving reality, so to speak? Are you working from the subconscious level, or are you working from your daily awareness, which is why it's technically a 9, because you have the daily awareness and then you have the subconscious, right? So what level are you working from? Are you working from the deeper levels of your existence, etc., etc.? So that makes it, the self is not just one thing. It's a very complex structure that are built up of 3 fields that all depending on, are you perceiving reality from the physical level, which is quite instinctual and just I'm in my body right now, just feel my body right now. But I am not my body because I know I can go beyond my body, and then I'm my emotions, but I am not my emotions because I know these are just fluctuating electrochemical sensations and energies that stems from the processes of my body. Then am I my mind, when we go with Descartes and said the cognito ergo sum, that because I think I am, is that the definition of what it means to be self and be me, so to speak? And the answer is no, because it, again, if you define yourselves from your perception, then these perceptions change all the time, and you are no longer just that, you are so much more. So that's how I see the impermanence. And for me, it's a good exercise to have this and say, well, now I'm in that version of myself now. And for other people that are not comfortable with this fluidity in the structure of self, they would like it to be the same person all the time. They have difficulties with me because when we talk, and one day I'm this person, and then I've had some encounters, and there's a little bit of imprint that lingers on in my field because I'm a female, remember? So I'm kind of engineered to have the imprint, but it also goes with the sixth layer of the advanced level of the mind, or the formations of the monastic level offers. It's kind of part of the transformative energy system that goes with the vibrational field and the radiation energy. So there are levels there, which I will go into later on with these 6 layers when we get there. But here we're talking about the 3 lower fields. And just there, without going into the expanded version of ourselves, because if you're saying, okay, Randy, who are you today? Are you the Buddhist monk, or are you the indigenous Australian, which I have a reincarnational memory from, or are you the English writer that lived in the 1800, or are you the monk that lived in France that ran from the church and flipped the finger and said, I no longer want to be a Christian? Or are you the Native American that had a very sad demise? Or who are you today? Just so I know. That would be nice to know, because anyways, it's just joking a little bit here, but these are also part of our processes of when we begin to re-encounter the previous versions we have had. And that level of personality structure blends in with our current personality structure. Then the sense of self, and not just the bodily sensations, and not just what's going on in our body will be affected by it though, but our whole self-construction will be expanded tremendously to work across all times, past, present, and also into the future, because there's this weirdity that once you get beyond the veils, as I said, beyond the limitations there are that blocking you from your past lives, and you go across that one and get into your past lives, then there is a whole mechanism, I call it the chiasm, that goes into play, that activates in your heart field, where you suddenly are both, when you go into your past and you go further into your past and even further than that and beyond this reality field and into all of your other existences. And that gets into the now and affects the now and changes the now. Then you begin to see the future from where you can expand with who and what you are in the now. And if you don't like the future you're seeing, then you go back and change more in the past and evaporate that and clear that one out, and then transfer your transformed energies into the now, into who you are now, expanding your energy system. And by that, changing who and what you are in the now and who and what you perceive yourself to be in the now. And then project it into the future and see, okay, what kind of futures am I connecting to now? Which level of my reality field, so to speak, of this reality field or beyond, am I now connecting to? But you have to have some of the past life energies that is part of knowledge as well, part of that pattern drawn into this one, to be able to do that projection that will blast you into deeper levels of existence. So that is part of what we call the 3 lower fields in my perception, put into a little bit different context. And again, just to put it this way, the whole transition science classes, I am actually using 7 courses of 10 videos to go into full details of these things. I've just given a little snippet of here. So Thank you for listening, and I'll continue in the next video. Thank you.